When I got detained here, everything has like completely changed. It was one of the hardest time, but it was one of the most bravest time because I look up to like my husband, I look up at what Edward Snowden was doing, Laura Poitras did, and that time, and many other journalists around the world, and I could not be just standing there and not fighting alongside of them. They only detained me because I'm a Brazilian. Laura was here a month before. I went to meet with her. She passed through Heathrow, and she was not detained. They only did that because the UK government, they still think the Brazilians and all the other countries that they call third world countries are countries that are worth less on the eyes of their own democracy. And they detained me. That was torture. When you have 9 hours, sit with 7 different agents, 8 hours and 15 minutes. That was the time that I have sitting there in that room until I talked finally to my lawyer. And I have read a book about all the prisoners went to Guantanamo. And for me, and that day, I thought that was my end for the rest of my life. There was no coming back from that. They asked me many questions on that day. They asked me about what I was doing, where I was going, what my work was. Every half an hour, one of the agents, and this can be paranoid, would brought 2 glasses of water and ask if I was thirsty. And then he would take that out, one of them. He would drink one and take the other one out. I didn't know what was going to happen to me. English is not my first language. Imagine you and the kind of pressure. They're always being held in there and interrogated. And when on that law, they say you did not cooperate, you go to jail. How can you do something in that kind of situation? Because of the law, they have to follow the law after 9 hours, or they have to arrest me, or they have to let me go free. But they wanted me to just walk in freely inside of the country because there was no plans to me to go back into Rio de Janeiro anymore. And when I was inside of that big place in Heathrow where they wanted to stamp my passport, I started screaming on the top of my lungs, saying that I wanted to see my lawyers, saying that I wanted to see the ambassador, that they cannot help me there. And for the first time, the leaders of them, who was always outside of the door and sent the different agents inside, he came in my direction, and I told him, if I walk in here, I'm going to every station television, I'm going to tell you on your soil what you guys did to me. And finally, they got me a ticket to go back in Brazil.
I remember I had this exchange with this extremely hostile and vituperative British interviewer. During the interview, she was kind of taunting me about the fact that I wasn't able to leave Brazil and I wasn't able to freely travel as kind of what she thought was a refutation. And my response to her was, well, actually, I'm going to leave Brazil very shortly. I actually have a trip planned to the US. And she said, oh, okay, well, that may be, but you can't come to the UK. I'm certain that you know that if you came to the UK, you would have serious legal problems. And in response, I said something like, well, I don't really regard an inability to travel to the UK as one of the world's gravest punishments. And when I remembered it with a little bit of regret, but then I realized that it really is hard to overstate how radical and extreme and what an outlier the UK government was during that entire period of 2013 and 2014 when it came to attacking journalism and intimidating journalists. It wasn't just the horrific detention of my husband under a terrorism law, and then a year and a half or 2 years of threats of an ongoing criminal investigation that severely limited his ability to travel and my ability to travel. And it wasn't just the fact that they were surveilling our communications and the communications of other journalists at The Guardian, which is how they knew that he would be traveling back from Germany after meeting with Laura Poitras. And it wasn't just the invasion of The Guardian's newsroom and the forcible physical destruction of the computers on which we were working in order to report the story, but it was the entire climate that pervaded here. The UK media, the mainstream media, by and large, overwhelmingly sided with the government against the journalist and against journalism. The most influential members of the media, not just in the right-wing Murdoch press, but in the centrist and even center-left press, were siding with the government against The Guardian, against Edward Snowden, against the work that we were doing, even in support of David's detention. And so it really did feel like this was an extraordinarily hostile climate. And I think with a couple of years of distance, it's easy to forget that. But at the time, it was really, I think, uniquely oppressive. And that was the context in which David was detained. It was the context in which we were constantly threatened about the work that we were doing and our colleagues at The Guardian. And I think it's the context for why it was actually more difficult than we expected it would be to come back here, because it always felt like a very hostile zone in which there were really no limits on what could be done.